What is up, everybody? Welcome in to this tips and tricks video. My name is Snack Packing. Decided to make this video because I feel like there's probably a lot of new people joining into Star Citizen, or maybe you tried out Star Citizen at one point, got frustrated with it and quit, and maybe you're coming back, or maybe you just want to see this video as a way to, I don't know, kind of navigate your way through the quirks, the bugs, and the nuances of Star Citizen. So this is going to be split into multiple parts. This first part, which is this video, is going to go over all of the extensive options within Star Citizen, since there are quite a few of them, and they can be a little difficult to navigate. So I want to be able to help you out in navigating those and seeing which ones are the most important things to look at, right? You can always come back to the video after you go into the game for the first time and you kind of experiment with some things, but this is here to help you navigate through some of these and what I have found over my years of playing as being the most useful options to edit within the game. Unfortunately, you can't go through everything, right? There's a ton of key bindings, which we'll get to and all of that. But I hope this is going to be able to help somebody when you go in here and you look at these option settings and you just see the sheer amount of them. Hopefully, I can help you navigate those and get through them so you can kind of identify what's the most important thing to look at. If this video does end up helping you, feel free to click the like button if you like it, dislike it if you didn't find it useful. And as always, I do appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel, as I will have more content coming up soon, along with the additional parts to this series. So I am going to take you through this and I'm going to show you kind of a few things that I've learned over the years and thousands of hours of streaming and playing this game. So before you get into the game, there's actually quite a few of options within the menus, which are, I would say, very helpful, and some of them are actually relatively important. So if you open up these settings and you go to your game settings, this is going to be all of kind of your what you would see typically in gameplay settings in a video game, right? But there's a lot of stuff in here. Like, this menu is just absolutely insane with the things that you can turn on and turn off. So we're not going to go over a lot of stuff. There's not really a ton of things in here that you need to change, but there is a few important things that will be very helpful. So first off, right in here, you're going to have some very simple things such as subtitles. Cinematic cameras, you can keep that on if it's not already on. Ship entry labels are very important, so you want to make sure that says yes. And then down here you have your toggleable things, such as your sprint toggle. If you prefer having sprint as a toggle instead of a hold, you can put that there. Crouch as well, prone, aim down sights, so your ADS if you prefer toggling ADS instead of holding it. Also, when you get down here, there's crosshair mode. So they do have basically a dynamic crosshair with certain combat helmets now that will show up on the screen. If you don't like that crosshair, there is an option to turn it off here. So you can turn that to always on or off. I keep it off. I don't particularly like it personally. I prefer to have it off and then just ADS whenever I go to shoot. It's also a crosshair. It's a dynamic crosshair, so it moves on the screen too. It's not just locked in the center. And then you also have hit marker enabled. This one tends to be a little bugged every time they do a new patch or update, or I think even whenever I just log out of the game and come back in, this one always defaults to yes, even if I turn it off. So this is basically going to be kind of like hit markers, similar to what you would see in something like Call of Duty, or when you hit a target, it gives you an actual notification on the screen, like a little hit marker. And it also does have an audio thing that plays with that as well. So if you don't like that, you can turn it off. Just be forewarned. I think it turns itself back on right now. Another pretty important one, or one that's very useful, is star map a zoom speed. If you have this turned down too much, you will have to scroll your mouse wheel so much just to zoom out and in on the star map. So if you need to increase the zoom speed on your star map whenever you're navigating and trying to set QT points and all that stuff, there is an option in here that is the zoom speed, and you can increase that, which will make it zoom in and out much faster. So if you're having issues with that, there's an option there for that. Now, when you get down here, there's a lot of default flight options here, which you'll actually see once we get into the game. You'll actually see them in the MFDs in the ship itself. So each ship can have kind of its own separate kind of options for this, but here's where it's going to be kind of global options. So you have a lot of different things. So you have automatic slowdown on, and what automatic slowdown is basically going to be when you have landing gear down on a ship, it's going to limit your maximum speed to about 30 meters per second. When you're first starting out, that might not be a bad idea. That way, whenever you're going to land, you're going to be much slower. You're not going to accidentally, shoot yourself into a wall quite as easily. So if you want to leave that one on for now, you can do that. But that's what that is, automatic slowdown. When you have your landing gear down, it is going to automatically cap your max speed and slow you down quite a bit. 30 meters per second in this game is actually pretty slow, and you'll notice that. But if you do get comfortable with flying and landing, you can turn this off. That way it doesn't do that whenever you put your landing gear down, and you can get a lot smoother landings. Now, decoupled. So decoupled is basically whenever you're in there and you're flying around, your thrusters, when you are coupled, basically, it's called coupled and decoupled. When you are coupled, whenever you move forward and then you let go of your thrust, it's going to automatically try and bring you to a stop. And so that's what coupled is. So if you strafe right, once you let go, it's going to stop. Decoupled in this game only pertains to what you would consider your keyboard movement, I guess you can say. So basically, like your strafes and your forward thrust, your reverse thrust, your vertical thrusts, and your lateral thrust. Those are what decouple. Your rolling, your pitch, all of that, your yaw, anything you do with the mouse to look around is not decoupled. That is still coupled. So if I look left, it's going to stop once I stop trying to look left. It's not going to just keep going until you counter it with right movement, right? So starting out, I would keep coupled on, which I'll show you once we get in there. There is a notification, like a space on the HUD itself that tells you if it's on or off. It should be enabled by default, so you shouldn't have to mess with that. But if you get to a point where you want to practice couple and decouple, you can actually go in here. If you get to a point where you really like being decoupled all the time, there's a default option so that it's off all the time. ESP is another one. You always generally want to have that on. That is kind of an aiming assist. So whenever you're flying around and you're pointing at a ship that you're trying to shoot at, it will actually slow down your joystick so that you can aim more precisely, right? So it's more of a precision aiming, but for your ship, which is very helpful. It kind of dampens your joystick so that you're not overcompensating and all that kind of stuff. It's very helpful. I would leave it on. There's a lot of options down below to edit kind of the strength of that if you want to in the future. It's generally something you're going to keep on for the most part, unless you're getting extremely experienced and you kind of toggle it on and off for various reasons. Gravity compensation is a relatively new option. Basically, how the game used to work is your ship would compensate for gravity anytime you had your landing gear down, or if you were just coupled, right? So if you were coupled, it would always gravity compensate. So you could let go of all of your controls and your ship would just float. Like say you're at a large planet that has a lot of gravity to where if you were not giving it vertical thrust, it would fall to the ground. And gravity compensation, it used to only really do it when you had your landing gear down if you were decoupled. So now you can just kind of have it on all the time, or you can just turn it off all the time. G-Safe, as for now, you can kind of keep it on. It's one of those things to where if you get into a fight, you're not going to be able to pull as many G's or turn quite as fast as you would with it off, because it's kind of like traction control on your car. It kind of keeps you from blacking out. So that's why that's what G-Safe is. So you can keep it on for now. Later, you can always turn it off. That way you can pull a little bit more crazy maneuvers, but you are definitely more likely to black out from the G's if you have it off. You can also make it so that whenever you're boosting, whenever you're using your afterburner, it automatically turns it off as well. Cruise mode on, you do not want to have this on by default. You will crash if you leave this on by default, so make sure this is turned off. Cruise mode is basically the new cruise control. Basically, if you thrust forward with cruise mode on, it is going to act similar to a throttle, and it's going to basically be like cruise control. So you're just going to like increase your speed and it won't go back down when you let go. You're going to have to counter it by lowering, by hitting reverse thrust in order to slow yourself down. So it's going to be a really weird thing to do on mouse and keyboard. It's very useful for cruise control. You can toggle this on and off so that you can kind of use it as a cruise control, so you don't have to hold down your thrust all the time, but you don't want it on by default. Space brake enables a boost. This is kind of a personal preference thing. Space brake, which is used by hitting X, is very useful, especially when you're decoupled, because it basically just takes whatever movement you have and tries to bring it to zero. It is literally just a space brake. It's like holding the brake on your ship. You can actually make it default enable your boost so that it'll be more effective. It'll slow you down faster. I usually keep it on. personally, but sometimes, you don't always want it to be boosting if you're using the brake. So it's just kind of a personal preference thing. Speed limiter on, you don't want that on by default. That is exactly what it sounds like. You can basically set it to 200 meters a second and it will not let you speed up past that. So that's what speed limiter is. You don't want it on by default. It is something you can toggle on and off as well. Probably the most important one here is going to be proximity assist. I don't know what the point of this option is, but it is awful. Turn it off. Do not have it on. I don't know what the reason for it is. Basically, all it does is makes it extremely difficult for you to move around in areas such as like your hangar and stuff like that. It makes your space brake basically not work. I don't understand what the reason for it, but if you're having trouble, like you're getting into a hangar and you feel like your ship's just not really responding to your controls the way it should, go make sure this is disabled because this one's awful. So just make sure you turn that off. There is no reason. I have never figured out a reason as to why this even exists. So some new ones that they've added recently is going to be defaults for your HUD. So they have the new advanced HUD. So there's two different HUDs when you get into a ship, and I'll show you once we get into the game. But you can turn these on or off by default. Prefers labels basically means that it'll show some text labels, such as for stuff like coupled and ESP and all that kind of stuff, instead of just icons, because if you don't understand what the icons are, or you prefer it to show text instead of icons, you can do that right there. Course predictions only going to be on capital ships, so that doesn't really matter that much. It's really just something that shows like which direction the ship is moving in. It's also not something that's super intrusive, so you can just go ahead and leave it on for now as well if you'd like. And then default lights enabled. I don't know if I would necessarily leave that on. That's basically going to turn on your headlights anytime you get in your ship. You can turn your headlights on and off with the button L if you want to, but this one is basically if you want them to basically be on every time you get in instead of having to turn them on anytime. There can be pros and cons to that, so that's more of a personal preference thing as well. And that's pretty much all I'm going to show you down here for the most part. If you go down to, there's a lot of like VJoy settings with their mouse flight. You can change some of these right here. These three are the main ones. If you're using your mouse to, pitch and yaw and all of that, this is basically going to be the range of which the mouse has to move for the movement. So you can fill with these sliders right here to make it so that like smaller movements make you move more versus like having to bring your mouse all the way out here from the middle of the screen in order to turn, that kind of stuff. And then it also does have a mouse dead zone as well you can play with, similar to that. Velocity indicator, I would suggest just go ahead and turning it to always on for now. I'll show you what that is once we get into the game, but that can be very useful. It basically shows you the direction in which your ship is moving, which can be very useful for landing. It can be very useful just knowing like which direction, like where your ship is going. Like if you're moving towards something, there's an indicator that shows you exactly which direction your ship is moving towards. So if you're in space, it can be a little tricky at kind of understanding which direction you're moving sometimes, and that's very helpful to show you. And you have more VJoy settings for turrets and driver, and you can change all of that. And then I wouldn't really mess with too much of this stuff right now. None of this is really super important for the moment. Look ahead is a big one. Look ahead is something you might want to mess with in the future. Basically what this does is it makes your character move their head in directions that your ship is moving. So you see how it says look into turns? So basically if you go and yaw your ship, your character's head will sort of turn with the ship to kind of look where you're going. And you can edit these sliders so that it's not super, you can either make it like crazy or you can just make it very small movements. The only reason I use this is because a lot of times I use head tracking, and the only way to get my stuff to work properly is by having this on but having it very low. If you're not using any type of head tracking or anything like that, you can mess with this to see if you like it or not. If you don't like it at all and you don't want your character's head to move at all whenever you turn, you can actually just completely turn it off. So they have look ahead for pretty much everything. You have the pilot options here, turret, driving, vehicles, all of that is in here as well. Some good options down here to change G-force induced head movement. If you don't like a lot of camera shake, or you don't like, your head moving, with things that are happening in the game, maybe that causes some motion sickness for you, various things like that. G-force induced head movement, I've turned it all the way down. It's basically going to make your camera move when you have significant G-forces. So say you're like afterburning like up, it's going to make your camera kind of slunk down a little bit, all that kind of stuff. You can mess with it and see if you like it. It can be kind of relatively immersive in a way. And then you also have afterburner zoom. as well. You can turn that on or off. You can mess with these ones right here. And then you have global camera shake. If you don't like camera shake in video games, you can go ahead and just turn that completely off. But these are kind of 3 ones you can mess with on your own to see if you like what it does. But you can always turn these completely off if you don't like any of them. Even with global camera shake off, though, there is still a little bit of shaking. It's not really camera shaking, but it's more of like UI shaking or HUD shaking that happens. Particularly whenever you're using the afterburner, like the HUD will shake as if, like your helmet's vibrating and stuff like that. But it's not really camera shake in the sense that your camera is moving around. So right here is another pretty good one. Vehicles exiting combat seats requires hold. So this is basically saying instead of just tapping Y to exit your seat, which is the keyboard shortcut for getting out of your seat, it requires it to be held down instead for less than a second, basically. And this is one that I keep on because I would rather hold Y to exit a seat than to tap it. So this is one that I hit right here. Party nameplate should always be on. That way, if you're in a party, you can see where your friends are at. And then down here is not really going to be anything you need to mess with here as well. All right, so that's going to be it that I'm going to go over here in game settings. So in your graphics settings, you're going to have your basic stuff, right? You're going to have contrast, brightness, gamma. Once you get into the game, you can kind of fiddle with these. I just leave them at 50, 50, 50. Unless you get into a really dark area, you can pump up. The gamma is going to be the best thing to pump up. Brightness gets everything very washed out, so you don't want to mess with brightness too much. And then contrast, you can actually lower contrast to make things a little less black, a little less dark, or you can increase it if you think things could use a little bit more, darkness contrast to them. Obviously, you're going to want to run on borderless. They don't really have full screen anymore. They got rid of it. If you're on D3D11, you might want to swap it over to Vulkan. Vulkan just tends to run a little bit better. You're not necessarily going to have an issue if you run D3D11, but they've added a lot of different optimizations to Vulkan. So and this is something you'll have to change anytime they do a patch, is you have to go back in here and change the renderer again. But if you do change it to Vulkan, you're going to have to exit the game and come back in, and it's going to have to recompile all of the shaders as well. UI aspect modifier, I wouldn't mess with too much. I'm on ultra wide, as you can see, and I don't mess with it at all. It's at 0. Upscaling, you're not going to notice a huge frame rate difference with upscaling in this game, just because a lot of the frame rate problems in this game are not necessarily hardware related. Usually they're just going to be the game itself, just issues with it, with the optimization, various things happening in the game that tank your FPS. So, if you'd like, you can use DLSS, whatever. Most of these are kind of poo-poo anyway. You can just turn it off completely if you'd like. It's not really going to make a huge difference. So HDR is going to be dependent on if you use HDR. I do not, even though I could. I've never really seen a huge benefit to using it, so I just don't mess with it. So a lot of these options here don't really have a lot of effect on the game right now. It can, but at the same time, it doesn't. So like sticking it on low is not going to give you a huge frame rate boost compared to just having it on high or medium. Now you can do all of these as medium and you'll have a relatively stable experience. It's not going to look bad and it'll run pretty decent, right? Obviously, depending on your hardware and where you're at. But you don't necessarily, if you're on a low-end PC, you don't necessarily have to put everything on low. It's not going to help you that much. Also, some of these options, such as I'm pretty sure scattered object distance, or maybe it's screen space shadows, you can turn this off, and the next time you load the game, it's going to be right back on anyway. So some of these don't even matter. But you can experiment with some of these if you like. They don't really make a huge difference. I think the one that's going to make the most difference in here is the volumetric clouds. This one is going to have the highest impact on A, the way the clouds look, and B, your frame rate. So you can actually turn volumetric clouds off completely. I wouldn't recommend that unless you just absolutely have to, because the game just looks much worse without volumetric clouds, like the planets and everything. The clouds really bring this game to life. So at bare minimum, put it on medium. It shouldn't affect your frame rate too much. It'll look a little grainy from a distance, but even when you're in the clouds, it'll look pretty good. Then you can mess with photo mode if you'd like to take some screenshots. Sometimes when you're flying around, photo mode's not even bad to play with, but photo mode makes everything look just tremendously better, especially with the clouds and with the improvements they've made recently. Field of view is going to be a personal preference thing. I'm going to have a pretty low field of view, or actually the number is going to look high, but mine doesn't go super. I'm not going to put it super high up here because on an ultra wide, it just makes things super out of proportion. So this is going to be a personal preference thing. I would suggest getting into the cockpit of your ship before you mess with your field of view. That way, when you're in the cockpit of your ship, you can kind of see like what you can see in your cockpit, and then you can adjust it to how you would like it without it being too skewed. Turn off motion blur. VSync, you don't necessarily have to have it on, but I keep mine on. Sharpening, I just have straight in the middle. I don't really notice a huge difference turning this either 0 or 100, to be honest with you, but if you want to play with it, you can. I just keep mine in the middle. Chromatic aberration, I turn all the way off. Film grain, I turn off. I don't even understand why that's in any games. And then basically the session information QR code, if you turn this on, is literally going to bring a QR code at the top right of the screen. So if you were to take a video of something and send it to CIG or use it as a bug report, this QR code they can actually use to pull up all of what was happening in that session right then. I'll leave that off. So audio, not a whole lot going in here. You're just going to mess with your volumes, master, sound effects, music, speech volume, ship computer speech volume, simulation announcer volume. So simulation announcer volume, I believe that only applies to Arena Commander. Race mode commentary, I have no idea what that does. I think that might also be in Arena Commander when you're in a race. Dynamic range, I always leave that on full range. Optimization, you have speakers versus headphones. I'm not really sure what it does. All right, so computer verbosity. Computer verbosity is basically going to be when you do something in your ship or something happens in your ship, your computer will talk to you. And this kind of edits the amount of talking it'll do. If you have it on full, it's going to tell you a lot of different things like proximity alerts, or it'll tell you your fuel levels every now and then when you hit like 50%, stuff like that. When you turn the ship on, it'll talk to you. So this, you can experiment it with a little bit. Turning it off, the ship's not going to talk to you really at all. But this is just kind of varying levels of how much your ship will talk to you. You can just leave it on full if you'd like. You can put it on high. I wouldn't recommend turning it off yet because it can kind of alert you to important things like you're low on fuel and stuff like that. Combat music, I'm not sure why this is off. I don't really know if it changes. They just changed the music system in 4.0 where it's like dynamic music system. So it's got a lot more music options than it used to have, especially in Pyro. I believe this is going to be turned on by default, so you can leave that on if you'd like. A lot of times whenever I'm streaming or I'm playing, I have my own music playing. I don't necessarily always have the in-game music on, so this is probably why I had it off. And then you have audio-driven camera shake. This is a very interesting one. This is going to be basically like if you get hit by a missile and there's an explosion, your camera might shake a little bit as well. So stuff like that is going to be for the camera shake. So if you don't like camera shake at all, if you have issues with that, you can turn it off. Otherwise, you can just leave it to default. And then play audio when the game is in the background. This one is in a lot of different games. Basically, if you alt-tab away, it'll mute it. If you have this off, if you have it on, you can alt-tab and it'll keep playing sounds. So I always keep it on. I don't like it muting for me whenever I alt-tab out because I alt-tab all the time. Okay, so controls is a very tricky one. And this is something that is just going to come with experience and just messing around with until you find something you like, right? So obviously stuff like mouse sensitivity, ADS, zoom scaling percentage. These are some things you can mess with. This is going to be your base mouse sensitivity when you're looking around. Do you want it to be less or more sensitive whenever you ADS? You can mess with that. Zoom scaling is basically going to be if you zoom in with like a scope that is a long range scope, you can change the zoom scaling percentage here for your ADS sensitivity. All of this you can experiment with once you kind of get those guns and you're like, oh man, it's not sensitive enough whenever I zoom in, right? You can change that here. Or it's not sensitive enough, or it's too sensitive whenever I ADS. You can lower that here. So all of those things you want to mess with in here. Turn off mouse acceleration, turn off mouse smoothing. Those are never good options in any video game I've ever played, so just go ahead and put those to 0. They don't help you. All right, so now they do have inversion settings as well if you need to invert anything with your mouse settings, but that's really all you're going to mess around with the mouse. You're not going to mess with sensitivity curves really and all that kind of stuff with a mouse. Those are more things you would mess around with a joystick. You do also have, if you have joysticks, this is where they're going to be. There's all sorts of inversion settings and sensitivity curves and all that kind of stuff you can mess with. You can play this game with a gamepad as well, but this is where all of these are going to be. So you have dead zone adjustments, sensitivity curve adjustments, right? So if you need to mess with free look or need to mess with flight movement like your pitch, yaw, all that stuff, there's different curves you can do for your joysticks. But this is all joystick stuff. So if you don't have joysticks, you're not going to mess with this. But if you do, this is where you go to edit all of those type of things. Key bindings, on the other hand, is going to include all of the different key bindings you can do in this game. And there is a way too many, right? I mean, you can basically set up an entire sim pit to do everything you can even think of in this game. So there is a lot of key bindings, but don't be off put by it because you're not going to use a lot of them at any given moment. They're really just there for if you want it, right? It's kind of a luxury thing. And a lot of them overlap, as you can see. Like one key might do like 3 or 4 different things depending on the context of the situation you're in. So don't be too intimidated by that. If you want to change anything or edit anything, you can go into advanced controls customization here and change whatever you want to from its default, right? One thing I will point out is the default push to talk. If you're wanting to talk to people in the game, the default push to talk is numberpad +. So if you have a keyboard that doesn't even have a numpad, you're not going to be able to talk to anybody. So that is something you might want to change. And how you would change that is just go to advanced customization here, make sure it's on keyboard and mouse down here, and you're going to go all the way to the bottom, VoIP, FOIP, and head tracking. And as you can see, default push to talk proximity only. So this is people close to you is numpad+. So you can change that there. Now VoIP push to talk is basically going to be like if you're in a party and you want to talk to your party members, they don't necessarily have to be within your proximity. You can change that one right there. So proximity chat, global chat, I won't say global, party chat, whatever you want to call it. It's right there. So those are kind of 2 big ones that if you don't even have a numpad, these are going to be very pointless for you. So you might want to change those to a mouse button or a different keyboard button. It's going to be a little difficult to find a keyboard button that's not already taken by something else. So I use my mouse, and I also have a couple of bindings on my joystick for it as well. But I just wanted to point that out because I know there's a lot of people out there that don't even have a number pad on their keyboard. And they're like, how do I talk to people in game? Well, there it is right there. So over here you have comms, face tracking, and head tracking. This is if you have any type of head tracking device, and it's also going to be your VoIP settings as well. So you're gonna want to set this to the microphone that you're using, whatever your input is. You don't want to mute your microphone, right? Microphone volume is going to be for your input volume. VoIP audio volume is going to be for the volume for other people in the game. So if they're too loud, you can come in here and you can turn it down. You don't want to do level activated voice transmission, right? You want it to have on push to talk. Otherwise, people are just going to hear everything that's going on every time there's a noise in your room in proximity chat. So you don't want to have that on, generally speaking. This is a threshold for that, the voice level activation. But if you have it on push talk, you don't mess with it. And then there's all your head tracking stuff. I use a track IR. And then they have stuff for the Toby as well. And all of that is down here. FOIP, which is facial tracking using a webcam, is in here. If you wanted to mess with that at some point, this is where you go. You can set it to a web camera, and then you can do all of this face tracking here, where it kind of acts as head tracking, but it also acts as face tracking. So your character's face will actually follow what your face does, and it actually works pretty well if you want to do any type of role playing or make goofy videos or just be a goofball in general. Face tracking is a pretty fun time. So that's basically going to be it for the options and game settings. Join me in the next part and we will jump into the game, and I will start going over tips and tricks in the game itself. If you like this video, I appreciate it if you like it, subscribe it, dislike it, whatever it is. And I will see you guys in the next one. Shoot me a comment down below. Tell me some, tips and tricks that you've come across, and we'll all collaborate and share in the experience together. I'll see you guys in the next one.